talk about ESG and the fashion industry, I must start with the caveat that I will be talking primarily about ESG investing. I will be focusing on what does it mean, where it came from, because I think there is a lot of misunderstanding about this topic, and only later actually get to the implication for corporations and the fashion industry. So I think this might help understand where many of the changes we are looking at are coming from. Let me tell you a bit more about myself. My name is Fabrizio Ferraro. I'm the academic director of the IESE Sustainability Leadership Institute. And I've been working on this topic for a long time. And when I started, I did not think that ESG would become so controversial. This is Elon Musk last year calling ESG the devil incarnate. And I've been studying and teaching about ESG for a relatively long time, more than a decade. And way before, I think, we had, especially in the United States, so many people that are anti-ESG. So this has become a very polarizing topic, especially in the US, and to the point that even a presidential candidate, actually two of them, is talking a lot about why ESG is the worst thing ever. So my journey in this space started with the financial crisis. And here you have a little bit of the key points in my journey in terms of academic studies on the bottom, and professional activity and case studies and consulting at the top. Another caveat for my talk is that even though I know that this is an academic conference, I will not present either an academic paper, or I will leverage what I've learned about this industry for a more open presentation about the topic, because I do think that there is also a variety of people from different fields. So I'm trying to have a larger, broader approach to this. Currently, in addition to my interest in ESG investing, I'm leading also this Institute for Sustainability Leadership, where we are primarily facilitating knowledge development around three fundamental areas, one of which is leading the sustainable transition in the financial sector, but of course with a strong focus as well on leading transition for corporations and cities. Why do I think ESG investing is so crucial? If you look at if you go back in time, this was probably the key institution in the Middle Ages and all the way to the modern time. So if you want, more broadly speaking, religion, not just the Vatican, was really the core institution of our society. From the modern times, the national state has actually taken center stage. So at least from the Western world, the 1600, here you have the White House, but of course, national states all over the world are central institutions in our world. If you fast forward to the Industrial Revolution and especially post-World War II globalization, the multinational corporation, especially manufacturing corporations, were the center of the world. To a certain extent, they still are. But I would say at least since the 1970s, the central institution in our world is the financial market. And I think this does not mean that the financial market is necessarily great or necessarily evil. It just means that every time we study a topic, for instance, sustainability and the SDGs, we need to understand how the financial market is actually looking at this topic, because otherwise we might be missing one of the core driver of change or one of the key source of resistance. I do believe, and again, if I will not necessarily go in much depth on my opinion on this topic, but I do believe that the financial markets have actually been, in the last 10 years, experiencing an interesting transition where environmental and social factors have become more central, and therefore they might play a positive role in this transition. Yet, of course, for the longest time, they've been clearly inhibiting it. Where do we come from? So this is not, the story of responsible investing did not start yesterday. So it wasn't invented, a few years ago. It wasn't invented by BlackRock and Larry Fink. This is not where it starts, but of course, we will see that the asset managers have played an important role. And it's important to really go understand where we came from. And if you look at the history of this field, there is essentially at least two key moments that led to what has been called socially responsible investing in the 70s. And it has started with religious roots, especially the Quakers and the Methodists. Very early on had specific prohibition in terms of the economic activity that one could deploy. And so the Quakers were the first to stop engaging in slave trading. And the Methodists started to basically shun investments in alcohol, gambling, firearms. And of course, later on, one of the so-called sin stock will be tobacco. Of course, this was very marginal, very much only the province of few groups that had strong religious values and wanted to align their values with their investment. In the 70s, though, we had the anti-apartheid campaign, which led to a novel conjunction of activity and interest between some religious investors, some unions and students and NGOs that protested against apartheid. And they realized that one way to protest, in addition to going in the streets, was to put pressure on pension funds, and through pension funds to corporations, to divest from South Africa. This was an important innovation, and somehow this is where some of the practices that today are being exercised by investors all over the world were born out of these activists, mostly New York, that congealed around this organization called Interfaith Center on Corporate Responsibilities. Yet, up until 2005, and with some growth, of course, in the 2000s, in the early 2000s, you can see that the assets under management of responsible investor were relatively few. So we were talking about like total of 2 trillion. So, which compared to the total amount of assets all over the world, it was definitely not particularly large. And it was a primarily American activity. Europe was starting, but was very early. So what happened, from 2005 on? I think we have a few key events. We have the financial crisis, we have the creation of PRI, and of course, we have an increasing awareness and attention on the topic of climate change. So this is where, in fact, the word ESG was created. So let's see where ESG came from, because this is also something that not many people know. So this was a report done by UNEP-FI, one of the United Nations agencies in Switzerland, together with a number of banks and asset managers. And the idea was that ESG factors can actually contribute to improve investment market and at the same time help sustainable development. Why did they talk about why ESG? Why not just governance? Why is governance together with environmental and social? This is sometimes a question that is asked to this day. And even early on, essentially, the argument was made that governance is crucial to basically put together and implement environmental and social measure. So this is why governance has to go together with environmental and social, which intuitively governance should be first. But this is the recollection of one of the actually creative minds that came up with this idea, was that they decided to essentially put the environment first because there was already some agreement that this was starting to be relevant. And the S was problematic. So I think this is particularly relevant for the conversation in the fashion sector, where arguably the social factors are more material and have a bigger global effect than the environmental one. And yet you see a lot more activity on the environmental rather than the social. So the idea to put the social in the center, to actually sandwich it somehow between environmental and governance, which were already more accepted by investors, was really done to make it palatable to a large group of investors. And then today, so we are used to seeing this is the MSCI, categorization of environmental and social and governance. So this has become codified in endless lists of environmental and social and governance factors that different credit rating agencies explore. But the idea was to bring them together and put them together as a bundle, because there are intersections, they are interrelated, and they were more palatable as a bundle. PRI was launched in 2005, and another interesting story is that it was really the idea of an unpaid intern in UNEP-FI. So a former PhD was there as an intern and had this idea of organizing and putting together pension funds. So this is another, let's say, relatively unknown piece of information, which is pension funds are crucial, have been crucial, and remain crucial in this space. So it was launched in 2005, and what PRI, the Principle of Responsible Investing, set out is a set of aspirational rules for institutional investors that were essentially saying that they would consider environmental, social, and corporate governance issue and integrate them in their investment process, because this aligns with their fiduciary duty and help with broader societal objectives. So there are 5 principles that PRI signatories sign up to, but essentially the first 2 are the key ones: integrating ESG factors and be active owners, meaning vote their proxy and express their view on environmental, social, and governance issue. So this has been, again, a pension fund revolution. These are, again, not well-known name. Most people, might not know that these pension funds even exist, other than in many countries, they are receiving a pension from them. So these are some public and some private pension funds. Most of them are in this list are public. And these were among the signatories, original founders of PRI. Three key events also really started to move this much further. One is the financial crisis. The other is of course, the BP oil spill. And then, of course, the emission scandal of Volkswagen. Why the financial crisis? This is not at all obvious, because some people, indeed, during the crisis or right after, were saying, okay, responsible investing is sort of a luxury. After the crisis, we cannot afford it. Well, for pension funds, the financial crisis was the real problem. And the learning from the crisis was that pension funds had to reduce the riskiness and volatility of the market. So the key goal that they really set out to implement was to reduce this volatility and trying to avoid behavior like the one of Lehman Brothers that could lead to major financial crisis. They tried to, so all of these events like Exxon and Volkswagen started to be seen by the markets as the main cause of return losses. So, BP had to pay up to 20 billion in damages, and he was sued by investor because of the oil spill. And again, this is not, without going too much detail, but it is only after 2008 that financial markets started to price in the post-ESG event. So if there was a major scandal or a major environmental spill or a major labor related disaster, only after 2008, the financial market started to notice. And indeed, if you compare the BP versus Volkswagen price drop, the Volkswagen one with the emission scandal was even harder. So this is UBS analysts in 2015. They started to say, this is a game changing. So we are now in 2023. You can see that they were saying this may be another brick in the road towards combustion engine obsolescence. So, of course, today there is relatively widespread agreement that the combustion engine will be gone in probably less than a decade. This was not that obvious in 2015. So financial markets are always looking for weak signals of things to come. So asset managers, of course, played an important role as well. Just to clarify, asset owners, sometimes, especially outside the financial sector, there is a lot of confusion about who is an investor. Asset owners are either pension funds or maybe a wealthy individual or a family office, somebody that actually own shares. Something like BlackRock or Fidelity, these are asset managers. They get money from other people and they invest them. Not the same thing. Very different, because they don't actually own those stocks. So their position really depends on the beliefs and views and opinion of asset owners. But when asset owners started to sign up to PRI, asset managers started to come on board, and that's where you see essentially the explosion of PRI signatories. So you're looking here at 4,000 signatories that have collectively under management 120 trillion. This is including asset owner and asset managers. Obviously, this is still very much a Europe, US, or North America and Europe activity. You don't see as much activity in Asia, even though these are not, so by 2023, we actually see a lot more of it, and definitely very little in LATAM and Africa. So these are, so remember the picture when we were in, 2005, we were really not talking about something mainstream. By the late 2010s or by 2020, ESG and responsible investing are mainstream. So we are talking about a sizable percentage of the total amount of money that's being invested. It's not few niche religious investors. It's everybody, basically. And that's where you see a lot of attention, of course, in academia. This is academic papers on responsible investing, ESG, and impact. Media articles. So, of course, media comes later. Yeah, of course, media comes when this is a much broader attention. And by 2023, actually, probably this number will be even higher. The last piece of the story, again, just to clarify the difference, because there is a lot of sometimes confusion between ESG investing and impact investing. And since 2010, I mean, yes, there's been a lot more discussions about impact investing, and there is sometimes again, confusions about what is what, mainly because the ESG world is, as I explained so far, driven by asset owners. It's focused on fundamentally still on risk return or risk adjusted return. So environmental and social issues matter only if they can affect the financial return in the long term. These are the issues that are considered by the investors. The world of impact really came from a different place. It came from foundations, it came from microfinance, and it's been focused much more on generating intentionally a positive impact. So it's not just about reducing the negative, the harm, but it's also really driving a positive change. And there's been primarily private equity and venture capital, while ESG has been primarily, but frankly, it's now everywhere, public equity, meaning listed equities on financial markets. So by today, I mean, it's common so while ESG investing, impact investing are different things, people talk about this spectrum of ESG and impact investing, or the impact economy, where, some funds might be more focused on the responsible side, mostly trying to avoid harm. Other funds might be more focused on contributing to solutions. Now, let's clarify that neither one or the other are pure traditional investment where you just don't consider environmental and social factor. You just don't care, or you give them so very little weight. Or philanthropy, which is you're putting money towards environmental and social causes without expecting any return or with very little return. And the idea here, again, what is at the end, what is this whole movement trying to do? It's trying to add another dimension to the way we think about investment. Usually we think in terms of returns and risk. The idea is we will have to think increasingly more in terms of the impact that we generate. And investment will be picked not only in terms of risk return, but also in terms of their ability to generate this return. Let me add a couple of considerations about this food chain, probably briefly, and then I will tell you what I think it means for corporations, what the evidence we have so far in research tells us about that, and more for the finance sector. So I just said, asset owners, who owns financial capital? Well, pension funds are one of the most one of the agents that control most capital. So some of these funds are huge. The Japanese government pension fund has like 1.3 trillion. The Norwegian fund has actually, these numbers are much higher now, but around $1 trillion. So there is a lot of money in these pension funds. And as I said before, pension funds have been driving this new direction in investment. There is one reason why pension fund, and I guess, or at least as I told you before, what pension funds and large institutional investors learned in the 2008 financial crisis is that you cannot diversify away from this type of systemic risk. Because these funds are so big, they end up owning a percentage of every major stock in the world. Something like the Norwegian fund owns on average 3%, and in Europe they might own up to 7% of every single company in Europe, in all over the world mostly, but mostly in Europe, US, Asia, so in the big stock markets. So if you go and look in Europe, you will see that the Norwegian fund is a shareholder in all the major fashion and apparel company, luxury goods, LVMH and Kering, or H&M and Inditex, all the listed companies. So they will be one of the big players there, and they cannot just diversify from a risk that is one of the company, because at the end of the day they're going to be exposed to these risks. So as universal owners, they basically realize we need to reduce the riskiness of the system as a whole. That means perhaps overweighting their investment in some areas, reducing their exposure, but also engaging active ownership, talking to company and pushing them to change. Notice that when academics, so this is a finance paper by Rob Bauer and colleagues in the Netherlands, when they asked pension fund beneficiaries, people like you and me that are in some pension fund, and obviously they have an interest in receiving a pension at the end, when they actually retire. They have the service and the study. It's not just service. There's actually more sophisticated studies they have done. All the evidence we have is that pension beneficiaries actually do favor more sustainable investing. And they do it. It's true that they do it even when they don't necessarily think that the financial returns will be higher. So it's true that in general, people will invest more in ESG if they think the returns will be higher. But the data shows that it's not really the only thing. So this is why, for instance, the Dutch pension funds like PGGM have been leading in terms of thinking about their portfolio in this sort of ESG, through this ESG prism. And they can tell you where they're putting money and in which category of the impact economy your pension money is going. So as summing up, consideration of large asset owners, they are concerned about this systemic risk. So they are concerned that this practice in environment that have environmental and social consequences will lead to some disasters that will affect negatively their return. And also, on top of that, they are often passively invested. It means that they invest in indexes. That means that they don't have the option of not investing in a specific company if that company is in the index. So this is of course a whole different discussion, but ESG investing does not just mean I'm going to divest from a company or I'm going to invest more in another that's better ESG. It might mean that you invest in some indexes that are created to facilitate this process. On asset managers, I just want to add one aspect, which again, asset managers will do what they think is best for the asset owners and what the asset owners tell them to do. I think it's important to realize that asset managers have been in a price war for more than a decade. And so essentially, we, as asset owners, retail investors or the pension funds that give them money and others, have been paying less and less for their services. So this has actually created a great interest in asset managers for ESG as a way to provide additional services. So asset managers, again, are not doing this only because I assume that some people do care about environmental and social impact, but there is also a competitive aspect to their behavior. They try to differentiate through this. So ESG integration, will look very different, of course, across different strategies, but it's important to realize they're doing it also because they really need to differentiate themselves. Again, as this whole sector became mainstream, the sector that provides data and ratings has become also very concentrated, and essentially the providers of environmental and social and governance information are now part of one of the big providers of financial information. So this is, again, we are becoming more used to this type of ratings as well. And I know here, just picked 2 ratings of luxury goods and the fast fashion business. Kering and Inditex, and you can see both of them are quite good. Of course, Kering is better, AAA, but Inditex is quite good. But you can see below that there is many companies, and actually, that are below, that are in a sort of average space, and there are some that are laggards. So what these ESG rating companies do, they analyze what the publicly listed firms do, and then they, compare them, and they actually give them a rating that is fundamentally based on the factors that they consider are financially material. So overall, indeed, in the listed company, there is, and especially the large ones tend to have relatively good ratings. These ratings are not only important because everybody can go and check them, but it's because they automatically are used to build indexes. And so investors can buy these indexes and these exchange-traded funds. And so they might know or might not know that they're buying Kering and Inditex because they are AA and AAA. Maybe you have a company, that is doing great, but it has a B. Well, they're not going to be in these indexes. So that means that there will be less money coming to your company. So I'm just saying this to explain how much this ESG investment strategy will affect the money that go towards your company. I think here, I don't want to spend too much time, but again, this is a whole world. There is so many different ESG investment strategy, but fundamentally there is like negative screening or divestment, which is where you don't invest in something, you reduce your exposure, or you invest less money there, or best in class, which is you increase your exposure to specific investment. Active ownership, we already mentioned it, is when you are actually leveraging your shares to ask companies to do things or to stop doing other things. And then impact investing is sort of this more specific, unique approach. I think this might actually help with the question because Ariel was asking, how does ESG investing help sustainability? It doesn't just protect the financial world. What positive impact does it create? Because this is still, it's very good question, and especially given what I just said, that it's important to realize that ESG was started and remains very strongly grounded in the risk reduction approach. So it is to reduce the risk, that the investor will have. So in some ESG rating are called, in fact, ESG risk rating. And of course, that's why it's like, there is a lot of, concerns that this is all greenwashing. I mean, I think we do start to have some data. This is a study that actually just came. So this was the references to the working paper, but the article just came out a few months ago. When they looked at PRI signatories versus non-PRI signatories, in terms of financial returns, so they basically cannot see a difference, but they see essentially lower risk in PRI signatories. So is responsible investing with very crude measure, which is signing PRI, leading to lower risk portfolio? The answer seems to be yes. Now, when you look at the relatively, and that's actually, so where do this money goes? It seems that it's going to companies that have better governance ratings and better social rating, but not so much, equal environmental rating. So this might feel like, okay, so it seems that responsible investors are not necessarily investing in companies with better environmental rating. So maybe there is no real difference there. Well, when they went deeper, they actually saw that there was an important difference between US investors and the European, and non-US, actually it's European primarily, but also others. US investors were actually investing in portfolio with lower environmental, social, and governance scores. So US investors that were signing to PRI were actually greenwashing. So on average, so there were, this was in fact picked up by the economists and by many news readers. One interpretation is that they were just starting. So it takes 5 years at least to really start to see differences in your portfolio once you start to go towards ESG. But in terms of the positive side of this is that actually the European PRI signatories did have better environmental, social, and governance score. Now, what is the mechanism through which all of these generate? So let me give you some other evidence, then we'll get to another aspect of impact. That's another important piece of evidence. In terms of decarbonization, institutional investors are actually reducing their exposure to high emitters. So if you see the percentage, so it's, you can see that one line is going up. So the line going up is essentially the exposure to the amount of the total equity that institutional investors hold. So as I told you before, these larger investors are owning more and more of the market. And yet they maintain fixed their proportion of CO2 emissions, which means that essentially, while they own more of the market, they are owning more of the market with lower emissions. So this means that if you are a high emitters in terms of carbon, you have less capital coming your way. So this is the first important mechanism. If less capital is going towards high emitters, or more broadly, companies with less good environmental and social scores, you have less money to invest. So this is a key idea here, and is already clearly affecting companies. So that's why, in terms of impact, again, consequences, broader consequences for corporation. First of all, you need to think about that you have so many different kinds of shareholders now. So you cannot assume anymore that all shareholders only want profitability and maximize that. I think that's not true anymore. I think it's actually up to you to also better understand what the shareholders want, and some of your shareholders are probably also interested in better ESG performance. Now, if you're doing better in terms of ESG, you will have lower cost of capital and you have longer term investors. So that's, for a company, that's very important, because doing sustainability investing requires capital and requires more committed investor. Now, if you are not doing well, you're not going to get capital. So ESG is a threat. And by the way, this is why you see this strong resistance now to ESG coming from Texas, oil and gas industry, all the places that, of course, are actually seeing the challenge. This ESG rating management is an essential part of getting this capital. So you need to understand how they are rating this company. And frankly, companies are extremely, in general, poorly prepared to actually talk about sustainability issues at the board and the management level. So many companies, there is, I would say environmental is getting better, social not so much, but there is a big need for enhancing this capability. And there is another consequence, is that because of the importance of data, larger companies and a more consumer-focused company, and especially in stigmatized sectors, are going to be more exposed to attacks, reputational attacks. So I think this is true definitely for high emitters, related to decarbonization. So as I told you, ESG is primarily about listed companies. So sometimes people say, well, I have a family business, so okay, that doesn't really matter for me. Of course, one thing that will matter for everybody is regulation, which I know you have many other sessions in the conference where you're addressing regulation. And regulation, I think it's not particularly, to me, it's not that interesting, because, of course, regulation is coming. You can go and check all the regulation coming up your way. You will have to do it. That's it. But why is regulation coming? Regulation has been clearly driven as well by the fact that some investors and some companies are doing a lot more, and they want to create level playing field. But there is another mechanism. There is another mechanism through which the financial sector is actually arrives at privately owned company. And this is the fact that your bank is also being rated these days. Well, it's rated by the investors, and the European Central Bank also does these climate risk stress tests every year. And as you can see, most banks don't do very well, And they are increasingly going to buy fewer bonds from, polluting companies. And when a bank commits to a net zero target with the science-based target, they actually give less money, or at higher rates. In general, they give less. So there is a decline in debt by 64%. So here you can see, it's a bit technical, but so here, the companies that have worse emissions are getting less money from the banks when the banks are basically committing to a net zero target. So a lot of other effects that are very interesting. This is also an unpublished paper, very, very interesting. But again, you have to get your capital somewhere. If you're not listed on the stock market, you probably have a lot of bank debt. Banks are starting to actually, they feel the pressure of this process, and they're also translating that in your debt. So a couple of comments on the fashion sector, because I think there is okay, I think it's the fashion sector is a broader sustainable issue that is not just driven by the ESG investment space, but of course remains a bit paradoxical, because you have on the one end the sort of leadership of some firms and like Patagonia, and the strong focus of others on the topic. On the other hand, the brand and the Gen Z like the most is Shein, which is clearly not in line with any of the environmental and social target that we discussed before, or at least we have no idea because it's completely opaque. So the paradox is that today, frankly, in fact, I don't think consumers say they are interested in something, but clearly they go and buy almost everything. So there is no real drive from consumers. And on the cost side, I mean, we know that this is not cheap. So, this is a very, kind of the difference in cost for the same production in Brazil, where there is a stricter regulation on labor, and China. So this is clearly something that is going to be hard to really change. And the decarbonization, it's also, challenging. And you see many companies, especially listed companies, setting decarbonization net zero target. But as you can see, a lot of it is in the material processing, and that will require a lot of technological innovation. So the challenge the industry face are big, but just to go back to what matters only to financial markets, as you can see. So there is raw material sourcing and product carbon footprint. From the environmental point of view, the view of financial markets is that it's all about essentially carbon footprint and sourcing. On the social side, obviously, it's labor and chemical safety and supply chain labor. It's all about labor. It's health and safety. No surprises here. And then, of course, governance always matter. So this is if you're being rated by MSCI, the weights that the different aspects are given are these ones. Now, there are different providers. This idea of materiality is something to always get back in the conversation, because otherwise sometimes firms can play numbers without really explaining what it is. So obviously, publicly listed firms will continue to face a much stronger pressure. So everything we said, if you're listed, you're going to get a lot more pressure. I think strategically, the dominance of the fast fashion model might actually be in danger, because the impact of a BP Volkswagen moment will be much higher today. You all remember Bangladesh, and nothing really happened. Very little happened after Bangladesh, and 3,000 people died. Today, something like that might not happen, but if anything similar to that happened, it would be very different for a publicly listed player. In the long term, I think we're going to see continuing pressure on climate and less on social. But again, private firms will face increasing pressure from banks, and of course for those that are owned by private equity, by their private equity partners. And of course, the opportunities are enormous for smaller startups, either brands with local supply chain and more control, because they're more credible in sustainability claim, and startups because the challenges that bigger firms have in their supply chain, both environmentally and labor-wise, are enormous. So in fact, I think, companies like Ganni, for instance, is sort of smaller, more nimble firms, I think they have an interesting and more credible approach than sometimes some of the very big public listed players. And I think the communication they do also reflect that, very transparent and also very honest about what can and cannot be done. So I don't want to spend, I mean, I know we only have 10 minutes, but I think going forward, I mean, these are the issues that every year I, identify for the future. I think for the future of ESG investing, one of the key big issue, which I briefly mentioned at the beginning, is the politicization, and also a bit of, sometime, as one of the question implied, it feels that sometimes all of the ESG is only focused on risk. And the reality is the evidence of impact is starting to appear very clearly. And I think the biggest evidence is that so many people that are being affected by this are the ones that, you actually want to change. So again, large emitters, companies with shady supply chains, companies that don't provide any information. They're always very aligned in saying ESG is bad. Well, if ESG was not having any impact, they would not be so concerned. But compliance, I think, might actually be a little bit of a problem because there might be more concern about, in terms of driving innovation. So I hope, again, I know there's not a lot of time for question, but I hope that will be more opportunities to reach out and connect with some of you. But feel free to reach out and connect with me. And thank you for being here today on a Saturday.